The entire upscale dining room fell silent the moment a polished woman at the VIP table burst into laughter and began mocking the single-father waiter in sign language right in front of her companions. She believed every cruel gesture would slip past him unnoticed, just another private joke shared above his head. Then the man set down the wine tray, looked her dead in the eyes, and answered back in flawless sign language. Her face drained of color. No one knew which was more terrifying, the silence in the room or the secret he had just revealed. The Sterling house sat on a quiet corner of North Michigan Avenue, its windows glowing amber against the early Chicago dusk. Outside, the last brittle leaves of late autumn skittered along the sidewalk, and the wind off the lake had already turned sharp enough to bite. Inside, crystal chandeliers caught the light and threw it across white linen tablecloths. The room smelled of seared butter, aged wine, and the faint perfume of lilies arranged at the host stand. It was the kind of place where a single dinner cost more than most people earned in a week, and the staff moved through it like shadows trained never to be seen. Caleb Brooks tied the black apron around his waist, with the practiced motion of a man who had done it 10,000 times. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet posture of someone who had learned early that stillness was its own form of dignity. His uniform was clean, but worn at the cuffs, the collar slightly faded from too many washes. He checked his reflection in the back hallway mirror, smoothed his dark hair, and stepped out onto the floor without saying a word to anyone. Behind the mahogany host stand Harold Whitman watched him pass. Harold was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with a face that had seen too many things to be impressed by anything new. He had owned the Sterling house for nearly 30 years, and in that time, he had hired and fired more men than he could count. But Caleb was different, and Harold knew it. He just never said so out loud. Caleb worked 2 jobs. The Sterling house paid the bills, and a second shift at a downtown diner closed out his nights. The reason was simple, even if no one at the restaurant knew it. 3 years earlier, his wife had spent her last months in a hospital bed, and the bills from those final months had not stopped arriving. He paid them down $25 at a time, sometimes $50, when the tips were good, and he never spoke of her to anyone. Grief, he had learned, was best carried in private. The reservation book that Thursday evening had a name circled twice in red ink. Carrington party of 6, 8 o'clock, table 11. Harold had circled it himself. Evelyn Carrington was the kind of name that traveled ahead of its owner. Real estate hospitality investments, a portfolio that stretched from the Loop to the lakefront. She had dined at Sterling House perhaps a dozen times in the last 2 years, and on every visit, she had managed to make at least one server cry before dessert. Harold had let it slide each time, telling himself that her business was worth more than the discomfort of his floor staff. He had told himself that lie often enough to almost believe it. She arrived at 8:04, 15 minutes after her party, which was how she preferred it. Her coat was cream-colored cashmere, her heels black and sharp, and the diamonds at her throat were the kind that did not announce themselves because they did not have to. She moved through the dining room as if every floorboard had been laid for her benefit. Her companions, 3 women and 2 men, all polished and perfumed, rose halfway from their chairs to greet her. Harold himself walked her to the table. He was unfailingly polite, the way men of his generation were taught to be, but Caleb had worked at Sterling House long enough to recognize the slight tightness in Harold's jaw. It was the look Harold wore when he was preparing for something unpleasant and trying not to show it. "Your server tonight will be Caleb," Harold said, drawing back her chair. "He has been with us for some time. You're in excellent hands." Evelyn glanced at Caleb, the way a person glances at a piece of furniture that has been moved without permission. She gave a small, distracted smile that did not reach her eyes and turned back to her companions without a word. Caleb stepped forward, set the wine list before her, and began the ritual he had performed thousands of times. He spoke softly, recommended the evening's selections, and waited with his hands folded behind his back. She did not look at him when she ordered. None of them did. They asked for 2 bottles of a Burgundy that cost $340 each, a tasting menu for the table, and a separate plate of oysters to start. Caleb wrote it all down in a small leather notebook, repeated the order back precisely, and excused himself. The first hour passed without incident. Caleb refilled glasses, cleared courses, returned with new ones. He moved with an efficiency that becomes invisible when it is done well. He did not insert himself into conversations. He did not smile too much. He had learned over the years that the best servers were the ones who seemed to dissolve into the room. It was somewhere between the second and third course that Evelyn began to laugh. The laugh was sharp and bright, and it cut across the murmur of the room like a struck bell. Her companions leaned in. She raised her hands above the table, fingers moving in fluid, deliberate shapes, and the woman beside her covered her mouth and laughed too. The man across from her grinned and made a few clumsy gestures of his own in response, which made Evelyn laugh harder. Caleb was at the service station across the room polishing the rim of a decanter. He did not look up at first, but when he passed by their table moments later to refill the water glasses, his eyes caught the motion of her hands, and his stomach went cold. He understood every word. Her hands were saying that the waiter looked tired, that his uniform was a generation old, that a single father working tables at his age was either pathetic or stupid, possibly both. She signed that he probably went home to a microwave dinner and a stack of unpaid bills, and that men like him were the reason she insisted on real professionals when she traveled. Her companions did not know American Sign Language well, but they knew enough to follow the joke. They laughed because she was laughing, and because cruelty when it came dressed in elegance was the easiest kind to enjoy. Caleb refilled the glasses without looking at her. His hands were steady. His face did not change. He had spent years cultivating a certain expression, the one that revealed nothing, and he wore it now like armor. He moved on to the next table. Harold, watching from the host stand, narrowed his eyes. He could not hear what was being said, but he knew Caleb's face well enough to read the difference between calm and forced calm. He took a step forward, then stopped himself. He had a feeling, an old man's feeling, that something was about to happen, and that it was not his place to interrupt it. At table 11, Evelyn was just getting started. The signs grew bolder. She made a gesture about the cheap fabric of his apron. She made another about the kind of woman who would marry a man like that, and what it said about her. She added something else casual and dismissive about widowers who could not move on, and her companions tilted their heads in mock sympathy and laughed again. That was the moment Caleb stopped walking. He was halfway between the kitchen and table 7, holding a silver tray with 2 crystal glasses of port. He stood very still in the middle of the dining room, the way a man stands when he has just heard something he cannot pretend not to have heard. The conversation at the surrounding tables continued for a few seconds, then began slowly to die. People sense these things. The room felt the change before it understood it. Caleb turned. He walked back toward table 11 with the tray still in his hands. Evelyn looked up, surprised. Her hand still mid-gesture, frozen in the shape of her last unkind sentence. Her companions fell silent one by one, like candles snuffed out by a passing draft. Caleb set the tray down on the empty side stand beside her. He did not speak. He looked her directly in the eyes, and then he raised his own hands. His signing was clean, fluid, and effortless, the kind of fluency that does not come from a class or a phone application. It came from years from love from a hospital room, where a woman with failing hearing had taught him every shape her hands could make. He signed slowly enough that she would understand every word, and clearly enough that the 2 of her companions who knew any sign language at all would understand too. He told her that her grammar was poor. He told her that the sign she had used for widower was incorrect, and showed her the proper one. He told her that sign language was a beautiful thing, built by people the world had once tried to silence, and that using it to wound a stranger said more about her than anything she could ever say about him. He told her finally that her dinner was on the house, and that he hoped one day she would meet someone who taught her better. Then he lowered his hands. Evelyn's face had gone the color of old paper. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her companions stared at her, at him, at the room, at anything but each other. Across the dining room, a woman at a nearby table set down her fork without realizing it. 2 tables over, a man stopped mid-sentence. Harold at the host stand drew in a long, slow breath and did not let it out for a very long time. Caleb picked the tray back up, turned on his heel, and walked toward table 7 to deliver the port. The dining room did not return to its rhythm. Conversations resumed in low, careful tones, the kind of voices people use in libraries or hospitals. Forks moved more quietly. Wine was sipped, not poured. Every few seconds, someone at a far table glanced toward table 11 and then quickly looked away. Evelyn Carrington sat very still for almost a full minute. Her companions had stopped pretending the moment had not happened. The woman to her left a thin blonde named Margaret, who managed a private gallery in River North, kept smoothing the hem of her napkin without realizing she was doing it. The man across from Evelyn, a hotel investor named Theodore Wells, cleared his throat twice and looked at the wine list as if it had become suddenly fascinating. When Evelyn finally moved, it was to lift her hand and signal Harold from across the room. The gesture was small, imperious, the kind she had made 1,000 times in restaurants like this one. Harold walked over with the careful step of a man approaching a fire he was not sure he could put out. "Mr. Whitman," she said, and her voice had recovered some of its sharpness. "I would like to speak with you privately." Harold inclined his head. He gestured toward the small alcove near the host stand, where management took complaints. Evelyn Rose smoothed her dress and walked past Caleb without looking at him. Her heels struck the floor harder than they had earlier in the evening. In the alcove, she did not sit. She told Harold that the man he employed had been rude. She told him that the man had insulted her in front of guests she was hoping to do business with. She told him that the Sterling House had a reputation, that she had personally recommended it to colleagues across the city, and that she would be reconsidering that recommendation, effective immediately. She used the word unprofessional 4 times in 2 minutes. Harold listened without interrupting. He had been listening to people like Evelyn Carrington for 30 years, and he had developed a particular kind of patience for it. When she was finished, he folded his hands in front of him and spoke very quietly. "Mrs. Carrington," he said, "I have known Caleb for some time. He does not raise his voice. He does not insult guests. If he spoke to you in a manner you found upsetting, I have to assume there was a reason. I will speak with him, but I will not be dismissing him." Evelyn's mouth tightened. She had expected an apology, perhaps a comped meal, the small theater of a manager scrambling to keep her happy. She had not expected this. She studied Harold's face for a moment, looking for the give, and found none. "Then I'll be sure to share my experience with everyone I know," she said. Harold gave her a small, courteous nod. "That is your right, ma'am." She walked back to her table with her chin slightly higher than before, which was the only thing she had left. Out on the floor, Caleb was working table 14, a young couple celebrating an anniversary. He took their dessert order without expression and made his way back to the kitchen. Harold caught him in the service hallway just past the swinging door and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" Harold asked. Caleb gave a single tight nod. "I'm fine. You don't have to finish her table. I can move her to one of the others." "It's all right. I'd rather just finish the night." Harold studied him for a long moment. He had hired Caleb on the recommendation of a friend, a doctor who had told him only that the man he was sending over had once worked as a hospital interpreter and had since gone quiet about that part of his life. Harold had pieced together the rest on his own, in fragments, a wedding ring that was no longer worn, but still kept the way Caleb's posture changed At the mention of certain hospitals, the careful silence around any question about family. Harold had never asked, and Caleb had never offered. That was their arrangement. "All right," Harold said. "But if she says one more word, you tell me." Caleb gave another small nod and pushed back through the door. The next 45 minutes passed in a kind of suspended quiet. Caleb served the rest of his tables. Evelyn and her companions ordered coffee, then dessert, then a second round of coffee, as if no one quite knew how to leave. The other diners stretched their meals as well. People sensed a story was unfolding, and no one wanted to walk out before the ending. The ending arrived from a direction no one expected. 2 tables away from Evelyn near the window, an older gentleman in a charcoal suit had been dining with his daughter for most of the evening. His name was Walter Bennett, and he was a regular at the Sterling House, a retired architect who had eaten there once a week for the past 11 years. Caleb knew him by sight, knew that he preferred the corner table, knew that he tipped in cash, and always asked after the kitchen staff. Walter had been quiet that night, even by his standards. His daughter, a woman in her late 40s named Diane, had been doing most of the talking. It was Diane who started screaming first. Walter had set down his fork, raised his hand to his throat, and gone the color of wax. He tried to speak, and nothing came out. His other hand began moving in the air in front of him, jerky and unfocused, as if grasping at something only he could see. Diane stood up so fast, her chair fell backward. She called for help. She called for a doctor. She called for anyone. The room came alive in the wrong way. People rose from their seats. Phones came out. A man at a nearby table shouted that he had called 911. Walter slid sideways in his chair, his daughter struggling to hold him up, his face slick with sweat. Caleb crossed the room in 6 steps. He knelt beside Walter and took the older man's hand in his own. He spoke calmly to Diane, asked her if her father was on any medications, asked her if he had any allergies. Diane was crying too hard to answer clearly. Walter's eyes were wide and frightened, and his free hand kept making the same shape over and over again. Caleb saw it. Walter was signing. The signs were rough and incomplete, the work of a man whose hearing had failed late in life and who had only learned the basics. But Caleb understood. Walter was signing the word for sting. He was signing the word for medicine. He was signing with growing desperation the word for forgot. Caleb turned to Diane. "Does your father carry an EpiPen? Has he eaten shellfish?" Diane went rigid. "Oh, God. Oh, God, the oysters. He can't eat shellfish. We told the kitchen. We told them. Does he have an EpiPen with him in his coat?" The coat he checked at the door. Caleb was already on his feet. He shouted to Harold, who was running toward the coat room before the words were fully out. He turned back to Walter and signed, quickly telling him to stay still, that help was coming, that he was not alone. Walter's eyes locked on his, and some of the panic drained out of them. The signs, the simple shared language, did what no spoken word in that moment could have done. They told Walter that he was being heard. Harold returned at a run, the coat in his hands. Caleb dug through the pockets, found the auto-injector, uncapped it, and pressed it into Walter's outer thigh, through the fabric of his pants. He held it firm against the leg for a count of 10. Walter shuddered. His breathing, which had become a thin whistle, slowly began to deepen. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. By then, Walter was sitting upright again, pale but conscious, his hand still clasped in Caleb's. The lead paramedic, a heavy-set man with a shaved head, listened to Caleb's account of what had happened, nodded once, and said the patient probably owed his life to the speed of the response. They loaded Walter onto the stretcher. Diane bent down and kissed Caleb on the forehead before she followed her father out the door. The dining room, which had stood frozen for the duration of the emergency, did not sit back down right away. It was the kind of silence that settles over a room when people realize they have just witnessed something they will tell their families about for years. A man at the far booth began to clap slowly. A woman near the bar joined him. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was on its feet, applauding a waiter who had not finished his shift. Caleb did not look up. He was gathering the napkins that had fallen off Walter's table, folding them, setting them back in a neat stack. He did not seem to know what to do with the applause. After a moment, he simply nodded, once the small nod of a man who wants something to be over, and walked back toward the kitchen. Evelyn Carrington had not stood up. She sat at table 11, her back very straight, her wine glass untouched. Her companions had risen with the rest of the room. Margaret was clapping. Theodore was clapping. The other three had clapped briefly and were now looking at her with expressions she did not like. She felt the look. She felt all of the looks, in fact, the way a person feels a cold draft from a door left open somewhere in the house. When the applause died down and the dining room slowly settled, Evelyn's hand tightened around the stem of her glass. "Well," she said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "that was certainly impressive. But knowing a few hand signs and stabbing a man with a needle doesn't change very much, does it? He's still a waiter. I'm still trying to enjoy my evening. Some people just need to know their place." Her voice carried farther than she had intended. The conversations at the nearest table stopped at once. Caleb, who had been on his way to the kitchen, halted in the middle of the floor. He turned slowly and looked at her. He did not move toward her. He did not raise his hands. He just looked. It was Harold who moved. The old man stepped out from behind the host stand, and for the first time that evening, he did not look like a restaurateur. He looked like a man who had decided he was finished being polite. He walked across the floor with the unhurried steps of someone who knew that no one would interrupt him, and he stopped at the edge of table 11. "Mrs. Carrington," he said, and his voice was clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "You have been a guest of mine many times. I have always been gracious to you. I am going to ask you now to listen for 1 minute." Evelyn's mouth opened. She did not get any further than that. "The man you have been mocking tonight is named Caleb Brooks," Harold went on. "Before he came to work for me, he spent 8 years at Northwestern Memorial Hospital as a senior sign language interpreter. He trained the nursing staff. He helped doctors deliver diagnoses to patients who could not hear them spoken. He was by every account I have ever received one of the finest interpreters that hospital ever employed." The room was so quiet that the kitchen door swinging shut on the other side of the building sounded like a gunshot. "He left that work," Harold said, "because his wife became ill. He spent her last year by her side. After she passed, he could not bring himself to return to a hospital. Any hospital. So he came here, and he asked me for a job, and I gave him one. I did not give it to him out of charity. I gave it to him because the man who recommended him told me he was the most decent person he had ever worked with. And in 2 years, I have not been given a single reason to doubt that." Harold turned slowly and looked at the rest of the room. "The kindest person in this restaurant tonight," he said, "is the one most of us never bothered to look at." He turned back to Evelyn. "Your bill has been comped, Mrs. Carrington. Please consider this your last meal at the Sterling House." Evelyn rose without a word. She gathered her coat from the back of her chair, slung it over her arm, and walked toward the door with the careful steps of someone trying very hard not to appear to be hurrying. Her companions did not follow her. Margaret stayed in her seat, her face turned toward the table. Theodore opened his wallet, set a stack of bills under the wine glass, and didn't look up. When the front door of the Sterling House swung shut behind her, the small bell above it rang once, and then the room was quiet again. Caleb stood near the kitchen doorway, the same place he had been standing when Harold began to speak. His shoulders had not relaxed. His hands hung loose at his sides. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been told he could set it down and was not yet sure he believed it. Harold walked over to him and stopped a few feet away. He did not say anything for a long moment. He just stood there, the steady silence of a father standing beside a son who has come home after years of being gone. "Go home, Caleb," Harold said quietly. I'll close out your tables. Caleb shook his head slowly. I can finish the shift. I know you can. Go home anyway. Caleb looked at him, and something in his face cracked very slightly, the smallest possible movement at the corner of his mouth. He nodded once. He walked back to the service hallway, untied the apron, hung it on its hook, and slipped out through the staff entrance into the cold Chicago air. He did not go straight home. He walked. He walked along North Michigan Avenue with his hands in his coat pockets, past the bright windows of the late shops, past couples coming out of restaurants, past the slow river of headlights. The wind off the lake was sharp, and it made his eyes water, and he was grateful for the excuse. He walked for almost an hour before he stopped, and when he did stop, he was standing on the bridge over the Chicago River, looking down at the dark water, moving under the lights. He had not let himself think about the hospital in 3 years. He had taught himself not to. The smell of the corridors, the squeak of the carts, the rooms where he had translated the worst news a person could hear into a language built of hands. He had walked away from all of it the day after his wife's funeral, and he had told himself with the kind of certainty grief allows that he was done. But he had not been done. He had only been waiting. He understood that now, standing on the bridge in the cold, the way Walter Bennett's hand had felt in his, the way the old man's eyes had steadied the moment they recognized the shape of a familiar word. The skill had not left him. It had only been kept. He walked the rest of the way home and slept for almost 10 hours. 3 days later, Harold called him into the back office before the dinner shift. The office smelled of coffee and old paper. Harold was sitting behind his desk, and there was a second chair waiting on the other side of it. Sit down, Caleb. Caleb sat. Harold set a folder on the desk between them. I made some calls. There's a program at Rush University Medical Center. They're trying to train hospitality and service staff across the city in basic sign language. The instructor they had lined up took a position out of state. They are looking for someone to lead it. The pay is better than what I give you, and the hours are humane. I told them about you. They want to meet you on Monday. Caleb stared at the folder. He did not open it. Harold, he said, and his voice was lower than usual. I haven't taught in 3 years. I know. I haven't set foot in a hospital in 3 years. I know that, too. Caleb did not answer for a moment. The clock on Harold's wall ticked twice 3 times. Why are you doing this? Harold leaned back in his chair. He looked at Caleb the way he had looked at him on the night of the dinner, only without the protection of the dining room around them. Because I should have asked you about this 2 years ago, he said. And I didn't. I let you stay quiet because I thought that was what you wanted. I'm not sure anymore that it was. Caleb looked down at his hands. They were the same hands they had always been scarred along one knuckle from a kitchen accident, knotted at the base of the thumb, where he had gripped his wife's hand for too many hours in too many waiting rooms. They had carried trays through 1,000 dinner shifts. They had not carried much else in a long time. He took the folder. The story of what had happened at the Sterling House did not stay inside the Sterling House. Theodore Wells, the hotel investor who had come in with Evelyn that night, made a phone call the next morning to a colleague who ran a foundation focused on accessibility and service industries. Margaret, the gallery owner, told the story to her brother, who happened to be on the board of a community health initiative. By the end of the week, Caleb had 3 voicemails from people he had never met, all of them offering to talk. Walter Bennett sent flowers. The card was handwritten in a slow, careful script, and it said only this: "You gave me my voice back when I had no breath. Thank you." Caleb kept the card on the small table in his entryway, where he could see it when he came home from work. Evelyn Carrington was not seen at the Sterling House again. She was not seen at most of her usual restaurants, in fact, for several months. The story had reached the people who mattered to her, and the people who mattered to her had begun one by one to be less available for lunch. A real estate deal she had been negotiating for almost a year fell through quietly in late winter. Her name appeared in a small social column under a headline she did not enjoy. She gave one short statement to a reporter who called her the words, stiff and rehearsed, and then she stopped giving statements. What happened to her after that was the kind of thing the city does not record. She kept her money. She kept her diamonds. She did not keep the version of herself that had walked into the Sterling house that night with her chin held high. Somewhere along the way, in some quiet hour, she did not share with anyone. She had to look at what had happened and decide what to do with it. Whether she did anything at all was her own business. Caleb took the position at Rush. By the spring, he was standing in a fluorescent-lit classroom on the second floor of the medical center in front of 14 adults who worked in restaurants and hotels and clinics across Chicago. He taught them the alphabet first, the way he had been taught it. He taught them how to introduce themselves. He taught them how to ask if someone was in pain, how to ask if someone needed help, how to say, "I am here." He watched their hands move and remembered sharper than he had let himself remember, in years, the first time his wife had taught him the sign for the word love. The way she had laughed at his clumsiness, the way her own hands had shaped the air with the easy grace of a language that had been hers since childhood. He had spent the years since her death believing that the part of him that knew how to teach this had died with her. He understood now that it had not. It had only been waiting for him to come back for it. On a Thursday afternoon in early May, Harold Whitman drove to Rush on his lunch break and stood at the back of the classroom for 10 minutes, watching Caleb work. Caleb saw him and gave him a small nod and kept teaching. When the class ended and the students filed out, Harold walked up the center aisle and put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You found your way back," Harold said. "I think I did," Caleb said. They stood together in the empty classroom for a moment, and then Harold turned and walked out, and Caleb began erasing the whiteboard, his hand moving in slow, even strokes. The thing he had carried for 3 years, the thing he had thought was only grief, had turned out to be something else. It had turned out to be a language, and languages he understood now were not made to be kept. They were made to be given away. The Sterling house still served dinner every night on North Michigan Avenue. The chandeliers still caught the light. The lilies still stood in their vases at the host stand. Somewhere in that room, on most evenings, a man named Harold Whitman watched the door and remembered a Thursday in late autumn and the silence that had filled his dining room when one of his servers had finally, after a very long time, decided to speak.